Good evening, and welcome to The Green Road, a Bible study in which we encounter the ancient texts from our sacred Bible that remind us that we are co-creators, co-contractors, as it were, with God in caring for and taking care of this beautiful world that God has entrusted to us. Tonight we're going to listen to something from John chapter 12. It may not feel like it's an environmental text, but listen carefully. Let's look at it. John 12, verses 31 and 32. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, this is Jesus speaking, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Jesus here is the Son of Man. The Son of Man, if you recall from last week, is in Aramaic, Ben Adam, the son of Adam, or the son of humankind, or the son of better, the earth, the soil, dirt. Jesus has come from the same thing that you and I have come from. We are, according to Genesis chapter 1, and frankly, according to science, we are made of dirt. We are. In fact, I heard Robert Fulghum once, a great preacher and author, say that we're made of stardust. The same things that make up the stars that make up you and I. Now, I'm no scientist, but I'm a theologian, and I love the theological implications of the idea that we are a part of everything here that we see. We are not separate from. We are a part of the earth. The problem is we've abused the earth. And by doing so, the people who suffer the most are the ones who are on the margins, the people on the edges, the people at poverty levels or below. They're the ones who suffer when you and I fail to care for the earth. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 25, that any time we care for the least of these, it's like we're caring for Jesus. And anytime we don't, it's like we're ignoring Jesus. It's like we're ignoring God. It's like we want nothing to do with that. We're just going to take care of ourselves. And when we become that selfish, the text is clear. We're not caring for God, especially for those at the margins. I remember a couple of years ago, me and my friend George, for a cup of coffee at Stoff's. We were there to talk about some theological questions that he had for me. And it was a really engaging conversation. It was great. And the cost of for our two coffees, I think I might have had a cappuccino, was like $8.47, something like that. And it was a great time. But I got to thinking about that when I saw these stats the other day. My coffee was $8.47. So even though I generously, wasn't very generous, but even though I picked up the tab and paid for both our coffees, if he and I shared it, that it would have been about $4 and change. Do you know that, let me see if I get these stats correct here, something like 689 people, 89 million people live on $1.90 a day or less. They couldn't get a half a cup of coffee at Stoff's. Another 24.1% of the world makes less than $3.20. 43% make $5.50 a day. I mean, think of that. Those are amounts that I rarely even think about. If somebody came up to me and said, hey, it's $5 for lunch, I'm going to pull out $5 or pull out my credit card and cover the cost of lunch without even thinking about it. That's an entire day's pay. If somebody came up to me and said, here's your lunch today will cost you everything you made today, oh, there's no way. There's no way I would even think about spending that much. The title of tonight's class session is Jesus Came to Save the Earth. Jesus came to save the earth. That's what's implied in that John 12 text that I read, that when the Son of Man is lifted up, when this one is lifted up, he will save everything, not just us, but everything. That word in Matthew 25, this word from Jesus, there's also a word in Deuteronomy 26. It's the famous Shema. Hear, O Israel, listen, pay attention, hear this. The Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbors yourself. It's a powerful text. If we're going to hear it, it means we can't abuse the land. It means we can't allow our rivers to overflow with pesticides. It means we can't worry, we can't let, and when I say that, think about this. And it took me a while to figure this out when I was caring for my own lawn in Kansas City when we had a house. You know, you have the people come in and they put stuff down on the lawn to kill the bugs and make it greener, do all that, whatever. Where does that go when the rain comes? Back into the ground. Or it washes off the topsoil and it goes down into the sewer and it goes back into the water system of the world. Every single one of us, I suspect, if maybe not every single one, maybe most of us, have in some way participated in this work. We're called to pay attention, to really understand more of what's happening in the land itself. You know, think for a moment now about the story of Exodus. Think of what the people are being forced to do. Do you recall the story? The Hebrew slaves? Pharaoh doesn't. He's worried. He's worried that these slaves, these Hebrew slaves, are getting too numerous and too powerful and too strong. And so he gives them even tougher orders. Now they have to make bricks without straw. But look, pay attention to the story. There's mud. There's straw. There's dirt. There's vegetation. The land is being manipulated so that the Pharaoh can remain in power. Weave that in with Jesus' understanding of Matthew 25 and caring for the least of these. Pharaoh is the model in the Exodus story for somebody who's abusing the land for his own need in order to keep those in poverty, those without power, to build himself up. When I think about how this works, it's just amazing. Keep the slaves. And then when we look at this story, it reminds us that Israel gets in trouble when it forgets its own story. So the short version of the Exodus, of course, is that Moses comes and he preaches that famous sermon, "Let my people go," best four-word sermon ever delivered in the history of humankind. There's some plagues, there's some tussles back and forth between Moses and Pharaoh and all of that. Finally, the people are set free. Remember, the Pharaoh was abusing the land to keep them powerless. Now they're told in Deuteronomy 26, Shema, listen, hear, O Israel, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's an important key to who they are. And remember, you were once slaves yourselves. Then you get later in their story, a few hundred years later, and Solomon is in power, and Solomon is using what is essentially slave labor to build his temple, to build his city. And that's when things begin to go south again. In Israel, in Jerusalem, because they've forgotten. They've forgotten whose they are. They forgot who they are. They were slaves, now they're putting people into slavery, indentured servitude, in order to help Solomon retain and hang on to his own power. You and I aren't slave owners. We aren't slave drivers. But it's important for us to remember our own story when we consider this. Rob Bell, that great preacher that I mentioned last week, according to him, he says there are 27 million slaves right now in the world, living in horrific settings. He also notes that there are 840 million people who go to bed hungry. 1 million of those will commit suicide out of absolute, complete despair. 10 years ago or so, the statistics said that every 24 hours, 4,000 people or more die from the scourge of AIDS. Jesus wants to save the earth. Jesus wants to save us. Some of this stuff comes out of a book that Rob Bell wrote called Jesus Wants to Save the Church. I love that title because there's so much truth in there. Jesus wants us to rediscover what's not hidden, but in plain sight in our ancient texts. To give ourselves over to caring for the world. The question, of course, is, do we care? I think we do. I know I do. I know my wife does. Do we care? I mean, here's part of the frustrating part. When we started seriously recycling, we reduced our trash from a bin this large, sometimes overflowing with trash, to about maybe a third of the bin being full every week, because we were on the other side had a recycle bin that was overflowing. We practically needed 2 or 3 recycle bins every week to recycle all the things that we were carefully making sure we would smash down, cans and bottles and paper and cardboard, and we had our 2 sons were living at home back then, so we were constantly going through a ton of stuff. We were recycling all that we could. We made sure to replace all of our bulbs with high energy bulbs that would last a long, long time. It was expensive to do, but we did that. We made sure to do everything else we possibly can to help our earth. Julie and I right now are thinking about trading in one of our cars and getting an electric car, so that even when we drive, we're not contributing as much to the earth's decline by driving a gas-driven vehicle. I've noticed in our neighborhood that our neighbors are great. They recycle like crazy. Shouldn't things be better? The problem is, keep recycling. Don't throw away stuff that doesn't need to be thrown away. If you can reuse it, find a way to reuse it. But the problem is, it's much more complex than just making sure we smash our cans and fold our boxes and throw papers we no longer need into the recycle bin. All that matters, but it's more complex than that. Think about the orange juice you had this morning for breakfast. I start every day. First thing I do is I walk over to the coffee pot. I push power, the coffee pot kicks in, we set it the night before, I turn it on, it starts churning away and chugging away, a beautiful aroma fills the house. Then I open the refrigerator door, pour myself a short glass of orange juice. I love it. When I was a little boy, this is when I started to love orange juice, we lived in Southern California, a suburb of Los Angeles called Santa Fe Springs. I remember it being a sweet, tiny little house. But right behind our house, I was like 5 years old, right behind our house was our backyard with 2 orange trees, real orange trees that produced real fruit. And then beyond those was this entire gigantic grove of orange trees. I grew up with oranges. I grew up drinking orange juice every day of my little young life. In my 40s, I drove back to Santa Fe Springs to see if I could find the house where I'd first gone to kindergarten in a little school that wasn't too far away from it. It was gone. It had been replaced by a freeway and tons of blacktop. So where do we get our orange juice now? Where does our orange juice come from? Well, one of the places it comes from is the country of Belize, where a Mayan community was moved. A Mayan village was moved so that an orange juice company could come in and take over this land and repopulate it with orange groves. Well, the Mayans were moved. It wasn't a popular thing for them to do, of course, but they were given a fairly decent place to live downstream. But then a problem developed. They noticed in their community that the children began to get sick. Why? Well, some tests were run, and they found that the water, remember they were moved downstream, the water had been contaminated by the pesticides being used, the chemicals being used to help the oranges grow big and strong and healthy, so that I could have a cheap, relatively cheap and inexpensive glass of orange juice. But what was the true cost? What was the true effect on the land, on the world? Jesus wants us to save the earth. Jesus knows that you and I can partner with God, with the creator of all that is, to save the earth, to bring our earth back to the healthy, lush paradise that God intended from the very beginning. And by doing so, we welcome back those from the margins back to the center, back to the land, back to what the Bible calls shalom, which means peace, wholeness, well-being. Practically, it means you have a roof over your head and food on your table. You go back and read Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos, all of them, Hosea as well, Micah. They focus over and over and over and over again on salvation of the poor. And when you see salvation, it doesn't mean being saved from hell. It's not that at all. It's salvation means being given new life, a new way of living. Have you ever read the book of Ezekiel? Ezekiel is the wackiest, wildest theologian in the Bible. But there's one section there where Ezekiel talks about why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah were mythological cities that never existed, but they were used as an example for how the Hebrew people should not live. Now, if you've heard the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you might think that they were destroyed because they were immoral in the way they behaved sexually, that sort of thing. That's what I was taught growing up. Ezekiel makes it very clear. Their destruction came when they forgot to care for the poor, the needy, the widow, the foreigner, the stranger. Over and over and over again, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, of what we call the Old Testament, remind us that we're called to work in partnership with God, to bring salvation, that is new life, to bring shalom, that is more than peace, to those on the margins. John 12 says that Jesus calls us to do this, to bring a cup of cold water, to draw all to this Son of Man, this Ben Adam, this son of the dirt, this son of the soil, this son of the earth, so that we together can discover the whole and rich, beautiful life that God intends. Here's our prayer for this evening. God, our lover, through the extravagance of creation, you arouse my love for you, and I am seduced by your grace. Awaken me, body, mind, and spirit, to the glory of your love in earth and sky and water, flower and tree and bird, ear and eye and skin. Amen.